Hi there, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering. Hey, in this video, I want to talk about something called the organizational life cycle. Now, you may be familiar with the concept of life cycle. I mean, certainly if you've been in engineering for any length of time and there's software people around, you've heard people talk about the software life cycle. And okay, so if you're not familiar with that, what is that? Well, it's sort of just like humans, right? First you're a baby, and then like a toddler, and then a elementary school kid, and a junior hire. You know, there's sort of a natural progression, like people sort of all grow up the same sort of way. And organizations, as it turns out, have a similar feature in that they sort of progress from the time they're founded till the time they, if and when they die. At any rate, a lot of this talk of organizational lifestyle, a lot of it really went into high gear. There were some things written before 1972, but it really kind of got some attention from a guy named Greiner. He had an article in 1972 in the Harvard Business Review. And what he argued is that organizations progress through 5 stages. So the first one, and he called the first one creativity stage, he called the second one direction stage, the third one delegation stage, the fourth one coordination stage, and the fifth one collaboration stage. And the idea is, there's sort of a central need in each one, and each one ends in a crisis of some sort. So in the first stage, so when you're having a startup, the first thing is we're in the creativity phase. It's just sort of the Wild West in terms of just, come up with a product, be creative. There's very little emphasis typically on process and things of that nature. Is just, be creative and just get things done. You don't have enough resource, you don't have enough time, and so on. And a very interesting thing, though, that happens with startups is that the very people, the key founders who were the impetus of the company, so maybe from the time the company has one person to say maybe 50 or 100, those people are absolutely critical. Take them out, the company fails. But right about somewhere along the way, these key people become liabilities because all of a sudden the need is no longer, the salient need is no longer to be creative, but all of a sudden it's like, we need some systems, we need some process, and these ultra creative people just aren't wired to provide process. So we end up with this crisis of leadership, and bottom line is typically the kind of leader that's good for a startup, for a small company, is not the kind of leader that's good for the company by the time they get to 100 or so people. The next phase is direction. So in Greiner's idea, the direction phase is that's where now we're starting to say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to get this tool, we're going to use it for document control, and we're going to have this process, and you'll do this. And it kind of needs to be someone to come in and to be a manager. That first one was all about leadership. The second one's all about some management of just putting some systems in to try to eliminate the chaos. Now, the crisis that develops is you have the guy at the top doing all this, or the gal at the top's having a great time, but the people underneath them start to feel stifled. And so Greiner called it becomes a crisis of autonomy, where you have only one person saying how we're going to do it, and the people who are perhaps closer to the issues, they're being ignored, they feel stifled, and this crisis of autonomy brews, and basically, if you don't address that, people are going to leave and the company's done. So next, then, you have the next phase for Greiner is delegation. And the idea here is, that's a phase now where we started to have these processes, but now the senior management is just having to learn to let go and to trust the lower level managers and to let people do what they're good at, let the experts do what the experts do, and stop meddling with this group and stop meddling with that group, and so on. Now, that inevitably leads to another crisis, which Greiner called the crisis of control. And what happened there is sort of, before the need was to let go, and all of a sudden it let go too much, and it gets to be like, oh my gosh, I let go, that was good, but now it's a disaster because it's just growing out of control. So the next phase then is coordination, where the company needs to learn to manage multiple projects and have multiple things going on, and not being micromanaging, but having systems to sort of do it. And what happens is, right about the time it really starts to you've hit kind of a nice place and it's getting to be stable, and you have kind of this machine set up. And also Greiner says what happens then is a crisis of what he calls red tape. The idea there is that you've set up so many things and so many that it's just like, wow, it's just impossible to get anything done. There's just so much process and so much procedure, and everybody's longing for the days of when we were a startup and there was no rules. And then finally, the phase Greiner talks about next is this phase of collaboration, where you sort of hit the balance where, with the senior management do have some control. They're not suffocating anybody. They are delegating, but it is coordinated, and you kind of get sort of a nice place. Now, Greiner made the interesting comment. He said, it's a crisis of, and he just had a couple of question marks, and he was sort of pointing to a number of organizations at the time that he felt were in this phase, but he didn't know what was next. Anyway, so that's kind of where a lot of it started, is with Greiner. Now, fast forward to 2013, and I apologize to this researcher. I have absolutely no idea how to pronounce the name. I think it's Duobiene, maybe 2013, at a nice journal article in the journal Economics and Management. And they went through and said, gee, a lot of people have been writing about this, and they actually identified 11 published journals articles that proposed different life cycles. And so one of them said, no, there's only 3 stages. One of them actually said, no, there's 10 stages. Most of them had 4 or 5. The thing that's hard to miss is, when you look at kind of the details of all these different stages, they didn't differ radically. They had different names and maybe sort of different rhyming schemes to, make them catchy and things like that. At any rate, when you read Duobiene's summary of the 11 different models, one thing that's clear to me is there really is not consensus on how many stages there are. There's not consensus on the exact nature and all that. But there certainly is some themes. Now, if we zoom ahead to 2016, and Daft has a graduate level a textbook on organizational theory and design. It's a great textbook, by the way. Anyway, he said, you know what? I think it's best to think of this in 4 stages. Entrepreneurial stage. So that's the emphasis on creating products. So it's that creativity one that Greiner talked about. And the crisis there is a need for leadership, just needing someone to lead us through this, sort of emerging as a company. So he's kind of combined creativity and direction. And then collectivity stage, and then what's happening there. Employees identify with the mission of the organization and spending long hours helping the organization succeed. The crisis in Daft's view is a need to delegate, where, in the first phase we had the leader sort of lead them through the creativity thing to get things started and some basic structure. Now the problem is just the leader needs to let go. And it's at this phase then that the early leaders probably need to let go. Next, Daft says, is the formalization stage, and that involves installation and use of rules, procedures, control systems, and then again using Greiner's ideas. It's a crisis of too much red tape, because you're spending all this time setting up rules, and then you kind of go overboard. And then he has what's called the elaboration stage, which is now we sort of hit the nice, sustainable balance. And what he points out, though, is unlike Greiner, who kind of said, well, I don't know what's next. What Daft basically says is, what happens then is either you hit this crisis of a need for revitalization. So what happens is you sort of get this steady state, and all of a sudden you discover that your organization's lost its edge, and one of 2 things happen. It will maintain its processes and slowly die, or it'll have to sort of revitalize, and have to be some leaders will have to come in and mix things up and try to find their return to the glory days of being a startup. So anyway, that's some thoughts on Lifecycle. Sometimes with these organizational leadership theories, or there's sort of a distant theory I can kind of hold at a safe distance. But I think many of you know that, when I started at Tandem Diabetes Care, there's 4 of us, and now there's 800, and I've gone through these systems. So, today there's only 1 employee who's been here longer than I have. And when I started, I was responsible for all the software at Tandem, all the medical device software. And there was one of my peers was responsible for the electronics, and of course my boss, the VP of engineering, was responsible kind of for all of R&D. And we lived this firsthand, and this business about the kind of leader that's good for when you're small is not good when you're big. For me, that's a little more than just theory, because I think most people would tell you that when we were small and we had to, recruit and set up the organization, as I was probably the perfect guy for the job. And what happened just a few years ago, I was working on my PhD in leadership and looking at all this literature and had this realization. In fact, at the time, I thought, hey, at some point, I'm going to be one of these key founders that's become a liability. And so I was kind of telling myself, I need to step out of this role before I become a problem. And so kind of, the long and the short of it, now I'm chief scientist. But, now that I'm a few years removed from that, what's very, very clear to me is, I was telling myself that I need to do this before I become a liability. But as I look back, it's absolutely clear to me I was a liability. And so that's tough medicine to realize. You pour your heart and soul in something, you get it off the ground, you do all this stuff that really is significant, and there gets to be a point where you have to turn it over. Now, I'm very proud to say that everybody who's running the software team now, those are all the young engineers that when we started 12 years ago, the guy who has my old job now, he was a 21-year-old intern when I started at Tandem. And he's the one guy who's been here longer than me. And, all the managers, there's 5 managers in this software team, and they're all, guys who used to be interns. At any rate, so, I have a tremendous amount of pride in the fact that I was able to turn this over, but make no mistake about it, along with the pride is also just a bunch of confusing emotions. And the point is, if you're in the position where you need to guide your company through this, my plea is to remember, the people who started it really do have a lot invested emotionally and made a lot of sacrifice. And the key is to figure out how to treat them fairly. And Jeff Moore, in his book Crossing the Chasm, he actually in one of his last chapters kind of talks about this phenomenon. The whole deal is how do you handle them well. And, I mentioned there was 2 other key leaders for engineering. Both those guys just kind of basically got mad and left. And I just got stressed out and finally realized, I need to do this. And, my encouragement would be to try to treat your guys, your founders right. You'll be better off if you can get them in a role they thrive in. There's so much organizational memory and wisdom and experience and all these things that you're probably better off. And the whole key then is for you as a leader, you need to figure out how to do this thing ethically and at the same time to do it definitively, because the truth of the matter is I was a liability for Tandem, and one of the reasons that Tandem succeeded is because I'm no longer in one of those key leadership roles, which of course is really awkward for someone who during all this is doing a PhD in organizational leadership. I mean, the irony just won't quit, but that is the reality. At any rate, so that's a little bit of my story. It's a whole bunch of the literature here. It is a thing. Organizations do progress through life cycles, and it's probably best if you lean into that and realize it. At any rate, I am Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like, as always, to talk about leadership and engineering, and we will talk to you next time.